of those guidelines is going to be to fill the tank with water, totaling at least 50% of the final spray volume, right? You don't want to go out and just start pouring pesticides into an empty tank. That can cause a problem. You also don't want to fill it up to the top and then start adding because that's just not the best way to do it. There's a pretty easy acronym to remember, at least with fungicides, but this is across all, is the acronym WHALE. So W stands for wettable powders, or WDGs. A stands for adjuvants. L is for liquids, and those would be things like your SEs or SCs, or the newer formulations from PBI-Gordon with many of our herbicides is an EW, or an emulsion in water. And lastly, you just have your true emulsions, so your ECs, your heavily based oil products would go in last. So you want to maintain agitation, obviously, as you're putting stuff in. And then once you've put all that in and you've got agitation and it's mixing well, you backfill with the remainder of the water. A lot of times I get asked, what about putting products together? Can I sit overnight? That's a very intricate question. There's a lot of variables that go into that. If it's just one product and you're putting it in water with a pH of 7 and you don't have many soluble salts in there, or cations like calcium or magnesium or aluminum, then you're probably fine. If it's a bunch of different products, or if you have a funny pH issue, or if you have a lot of solids in there, then you maybe don't want to let it sit for more than a couple hours. And that's the first question, is can I mix product X with product Y? We get this all the time, especially on the R&D end. Somebody wants to go out and mix Segway with another product. Is it going to be okay? Well, there's a lot of information on safety data sheets, which you're going to need to have around anyway, just for reference. And you can go find a lot of good information on these. I would recommend, or at least I should say our chemist recommends, getting your water tested twice a year. So talk to your landscape supply reps and find out about getting water tested in the spring and in the fall, because depending on the time of year, you might have more dissolvable solids in there versus other times of the year. And pH may vary by time of year as well. So anyway, when you look at a safety data sheet, there's some really important information. This page number can vary by depending on which company's SDS sheets you're looking at. But you want to go look for the pH value. This is important because when you're mixing chemicals, the first thing I can tell you, the easiest answer to all of your can I mix these products together is do a jar test. Put them in equal ratio and do a jar test. That's the easiest thing. I know it's not what everybody wants to do. They just want a quick answer. But the general rule of thumb is if you have products with vastly different pH values greater than a scale of 2, you don't want to let them sit for a prolonged period of time. So say, for example, for whatever reason, you were mixing this product, T-Zone, which has a pH of 7.5 to 8.5, and you were putting aluminum tris, otherwise known as Signature, in the tank. Obviously that's not a common mixture you'd go with, but Signature has a very low pH. So it's going to be probably almost like 3 or 4 pH scales apart. And in that scenario, that's where you can start to get a degradation of products if they're sitting for a while. If you're mixing products, one's a 6.5 and one's a 7.5, you're totally fine. And it's probably not going to cause any issues. But again, that's why it's important to look at your water quality, because if you do have a lot of dissolvable solids in there, even though your pHs are pretty close, that's not going to be a pH issue with the products. But if you're letting it sit for a while, that might be an issue, especially if you have aluminum cations, magnesium cations, or calcium cations in large quantities in your water. So water quality, like I said, have it tested twice a year. Optimally, you want to be closer to 7. And if you need to, you would want to use buffers. But again, it goes back to how long it sits in the tank. Check your SDS sheet. Anything with greater than a 2 scale difference, that's where you don't want to let it sit for sure. Checking for total dissolvable solids. Like I said, clogging with products is mostly caused by your divalent cations, iron, magnesium, and sodium. But also, and almost worse probably, is going to be aluminum, because that's going to go seek out and bind. And then check for carbonates and bicarbonates as well. There's actually a lot in this photo. If you're ever not sure if you have issues with water, just look at an irrigation. You can see the irrigation heads exactly where they're hitting the side of this building. And they have a lot of iron in them because you can see the rust forming where the irrigation heads, if you look all down that building, you can see where the irrigation heads are hitting that side of that building. So keep an eye out for things like that as well, because that can greatly affect your fungicide performance when you're making applications. Okay, transitioning a little from water quality, but just still talking about the importance of water. And this is really going to be critical as we talk about the different diseases that I'm going to cover today and control of those diseases, because post-application irrigation is probably almost as important as the product you select. And I'm going to show you why. How much is ideal? In addition to the water quality questions, or can I mix this product with this product? This would be next in line. I can't tell you all the time what's perfect for your facility. I don't know how many minutes it takes for your irrigation cycle to run. I don't know how much water it's putting out. Is it a rainbird system or a Taro system? When's the last time you went out and put a rain gauge out there and actually looked at how much time gives you how much water? I can tell you some things that we do in the research world to look at how much we need. Really ideal, depending on the product and depending on the pathogen, 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch is ideal. 1/4 of an inch is better, or 2/10 to 1/4 of an inch is better for something like fairy ring, because that can vary where it's at in the root zone. But most of the time, you need at least 1/8 of an inch of water. So if that's 8 minutes or 16 minutes, whatever it is, you need typically at least that for your root pathogens. Then we get to how much is realistic. I understand for some people to put out 2/10 of an inch of water is going to take a lot of time, and it may not be as realistic. If you can't get that far, that's okay. But you really, if you're watering in products for soil-borne pathogens, you really need at least 1/8 of an inch. After I answer that question, I always get, well, if I put that much water down, isn't it going to water that product or that fungicide through the root zone? The shortest answer I can give you, no. Now that can change if you're using certain other pesticides, like insecticides, are able to move rather through a significant part of the root zone. But with fungicides, I'm going to show you why the answer is no. So this is work that was done by now Dr. Wendell Hutchins, who is at the University of Arkansas, but this was his graduate work at NC State University. So there's a very important thing to know, or to look at, or to consider, maybe I should say, when you're choosing a fungicide for a root-based pathogen. So remember, we're controlling the pathogen. We're not really controlling the disease. The disease is the effects of what you see from infection from a pathogen. So the active ingredient or the fungicide you're going to use is going to control that pathogen. And one thing you can look at very easily to determine the ability of a fungicide, or really any chemical that you can think of, to bind to organic matter is called the KOC value, or the sorption ratio. Every chemical has this, and it's just the affinity of it to bind to organic matter. So if you look at the DMI class here, you can see there are very different numbers. So if you look at difenconazole, for example, that's got a rather high KOC value, and it's somewhat immobile, versus something like tebuconazole, which, depending on your soil type, might be as low as 470, which is going to be somewhat able to move. Same thing with triticconazole, okay? You can look in the SDHI class with something like penthiopyrad, that's around 500. One we'll talk about shortly here is isofetamide. That's around 350. And you can compare that with another SDHI like fluxapyroxad, which could be much higher depending on your soil type and may have much less movement. This is important because if you have a lot of organic matter, a lot of thatch or high organic matter content, it may, or if you're on a push-up green with native soil, that product may not move down as low or as much as it is if it's in a pure sand green. The figure on the right here is a cool figure associated with this work. showing the influence of irrigation of azoxystrobin. Now, azoxystrobin is one of the strobilurin fungicides that can move the most, or at least has a lower KOC value, and I'll get more to that later. But this is looking at quality, average turfgrass quality on summer patch with creeping bentgrass. We're not going to talk about summer patch today, but this is an interesting graph just to show you. If you don't irrigate at all, obviously you're not going to get as high a quality, because this is a patch disease, an ectotrophic root infecting fungi, and you need to get the fungicide to where the pathogen is. The pathogen is not in the foliage. So obviously there's probably disease where there's no irrigation, and that's why it has lower quality. You can see as you start bumping up in the irrigation amounts, when they share a letter, they're not significantly different. So anywhere from 0.1 to 0.25 inches, 0.125 inches, I should say, I'm sorry, provided the best turfgrass quality. And 0.125 inches would be equivalent to 1/8 of an inch of irrigation. That's typically what we've recommended for a long time for summer patch. When you get to 0.25 inches, I don't know that you're losing a whole lot of turfgrass quality. You're kind of splitting hairs here, but at the same time, it could be that you're just getting it a little more past where you need it to be. So where does the fungicide?
Hey, Brian, I got a quick question. Can you go back to that last slide, and maybe you're about to cover it? So I'm a little confused by the KOC values. So you're saying a lower KOC value is more likely to move or bind, or a higher KOC value is more likely to bind to organic matter?
That is, so both ways you said that are correct. So the lower the KOC value, the higher the affinity to bind to organic matter. So it just is a crazy example here. If you look at something like dicamba or dinotefuran, which is an insecticide, they have KOC values in like the 10 to 20 range, depending on soil type. So they actually will move. But with fungicides, mefenoxam is one of the lowest ones that you'll see, and that's significantly greater. So fungicides, the short of this is, if you look at the KOC value, the lower it is, the more it is able to go down into the root zone. But even still, with fungicides, you will not water it through the root zone, is what I'm trying to say. Gotcha. And I am gonna get to a slide here to show you. But does that clarify, or?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so this is actually looking at two different fungicides of C14 radio-labeled material, and what they do is they radio-label it with carbon-14 to watch it. You can watch it move, but the challenge with this, and the reason we don't have this done with every single fungicide and every single product, is because it is extremely expensive to radio-label an active ingredient and to do this type of work. So you typically only see it with certain products that are found in the ag market when they first discover, let's say, a new mode of action. So looking at these two charts, on the left-hand side is myclobutanil, which is a DMI fungicide, goes by the name of Eagle. And on the right is tebuconazole. I'm sure everybody's familiar with tebuconazole. And you can see that the KOC values are somewhat similar of these two. A lot of times when there's a range, I would tend to say that you're looking more on the lower end, or assume that, but that's not always the case. Again, it just depends how much organic matter or how quote unquote heavy a soil is versus a sand. But if we're talking greens or if you're on coastal areas, you're going to go to that lower value. But if you look on the left at myclobutanil, the dark green bar, or I should say the bars going across with the different colors there are going to show you the amount of irrigation that goes down, okay? The sampling depth that they looked for the radio-labeled material is on the left-hand side. And what you can see with both of these, I'm just going to summarize this, almost all of the fungicide, regardless of how much irrigation they put down, is found in the top 2 inches of soil. You can see very, very little, even with an inch of an irrigation, is pushing down even below 3 inches. And that's with tebuconazole, which is able to move a little bit farther. So, when people ask like, oh, if I put out more than an inch of water or a quarter inch of water, there's no way that product's gonna work because I'm watering it through. Well, you're really not, because it's binding to organic matter as it goes down, and the lion's share, regardless of product, is going to be in that top 2 inches. But that's kind of a good thing because that's where most of our root pathogens exist. The moral of this story is don't worry about watering too much. Or if you get a half of inch of rain after you make an application, don't worry like that product is lost because of too much irrigation. This is a good one, showing the effects of wetting agents. This was, again, work done out of NC State. They've kind of pioneered a lot of this work in the turf end of the world, with movement of different pesticides. But on the left, you can see the amount of fungicide that's recovered when a wetting agent's included. So regardless of how much irrigation was put down, you're going to see recovery of that fungicide a little bit lower. Okay, so in this case, the 2 to 3, and if you go with an inch, the 3 to 4 area of the root zone, versus if you're not using a wetting agent, you're going to miss out getting it down, let's say in this case, or in this particular example, almost another inch of where you're getting at least 10% of that material to 20% of that material down. So when your distributor or manufacturer is telling you, hey, use a wetting agent, it's going to help you get material down, this is empirical evidence that it really actually does help. And especially the more water you put down, or if you're on a regular wetting agent program, if you're going out with a quarter inch of water or an eighth inch of water with that, it's going to help get that material farther down. So it's really helpful as we get into the disease end of this talk to consider using wetting agents as part of a program if you're not on one, if you're struggling with controlling some of these soil-borne pathogens in warm season turf. Are there any additional questions on that before I move on to the actual just disease control portion of the presentation?
Yeah, and I failed to mention this at the beginning. If somebody in the crowd has a question, you can raise your hand with the function on Zoom at the bottom. There's a raise hand function, or there's a chat function you can type in. If you raise your hand on mute, you can ask your question. Otherwise, you can type it in chat, and I'll monitor those.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. Yeah, I forgot to say at the beginning too. I was going to say just shout out if you have a question, I can stop. But we'll do the chat method. All right. So how to prevent disease. I know this is very basic, but just to cover it again quickly for the educational portion of this. So the 3 things you need in order to have disease occur, or that determines the amount of disease, is the host, the pathogen, and the environment. For all intents and purposes, many times you can just assume that the pathogen is present. It really determines how much of a host is present, or if a susceptible host is even present. And then also you need a conducive environment. If you don't have all 3 of those things together, occurring at the same time, and for a continued period of time, you're really not going to get any disease. And I'll go through some examples. So first is altering the environment. Typically, this is easily done, or most readily done, with foliar pathogens. So a lot of times around greens, you either thin out trees, cut down shrubs, remove shrubs, add fans to increase air movement, and that's one way you can alter the environment. Preventing the pathogen. This is typically the least easy one of these to do. You're not going to entirely prevent the pathogen by use of a fungicide, but if you were to construct a new green and you used, let's say, basement or something like that, that would be one way to eradicate a pathogen. But the challenge is anytime you're moving soil or plant material, sod, aerification, mowing, that at that point, eventually pathogens are going to become established as well. And then lastly, probably the easiest one, which isn't going to show up here on my computer for some reason, is altering the hosts. A rough example for this is if you have perennial ryegrass fairways and you're dealing or struggling a lot with bipolaris leaf spot or gray leaf spot in particular, you could just change the host. You could use Kentucky bluegrass, because Kentucky bluegrass is not going to get gray leaf spot. Or if you have a huge problem with brown patch, and it's on ryegrass, you could move it to something in a rough area. You could use something like turf type tall fescue, which tends to be a little bit less susceptible, at least the newer cultivars, to brown patch than something like ryegrass. So those are ways that you can prevent disease, but you're not entirely going to prevent it, which is why we need fungicides. And when you're looking to determine which pathogen it is, there's some terms we typically use. There are signs of a pathogen that are the actual fungal structures that you're going to see. That could be things like mycelia, mushrooms, sclerotia, red thread there in the middle, or this time of year you see lots of these red spores growing on the leaf tissue with rust, versus symptoms of a pathogen, right? So symptoms are going to be things like lesions on individual leaves, the actual rings that you're looking at with fairy ring or brown patch. Sometimes you get symptoms occurring with signs. So in the center picture, you see fairy ring symptoms, but you also see signs of the pathogen. You see mushrooms coming up there in a few spots. So a lot of times they occur together, but just so you know, when I'm talking about signs or symptoms, that's what I'm referring to. And when we're looking at fungal pathogens, there's a few different types. There's two different types of true fungi. There's ascomycetes and basidiomycetes. The differences of these are not all that important to you. From a mycology standpoint, you don't need to know, but a lot of times it is when you're choosing what type of fungicides you're looking at. So if you're looking at ascomycetes, those are a bunch of the diseases we're going to talk about today: take all root rot, spring dead spot, or things like basidiomycetes, which are fairy ring, large patch, brown patch, rust. One of the important things is to know, or knowing why, is because which fungicides you use. So, for example, true fungi have ergosterol in their cell membranes, which help with cell structure. And a product that targets that is going to be the DMI fungicides, or the sterol biosynthesis inhibitors. They target ergosterol, which is very similar to cholesterol in humans. We also have oomycetes, which we'll talk about with Pythium root rot today. They're different from true fungi for reasons that aren't all that important, again, from a turfgrass manager's perspective, other than they don't have chitin in their cell walls. So polyoxin D, or Affirm, is a product that's not going to be very effective in controlling Pythium because it targets chitin, and they don't have chitin in their cell walls. Also, oomycetes don't have ergosterol. So anytime you use a DMI fungicide, that's really not going to add anything to helping to control a Pythium species because they don't have ergosterol. So just some subtle things to know there. Lastly, going through contacts and penetrants. And we all know what contact and penetrants are, but just as a refresher, contacts, those are going to be things like chlorothalonil, fluazinum, and mancozeb. These tend to provide shorter intervals of protection because they stay on the outside of the plant. They also have extremely high KOC values, so they do not control your root diseases much at all, and you don't want to water them in. You want to leave them because they need to cover the outside of the plant in order to prevent infection. Versus our penetrant fungicides, which is what we're going to speak of today when I'm mentioning control options for controlling your root-borne pathogens. We split them into different types of movement, but movement is studied in agricultural commodities, things like soybean or corn. So if it moves a foot in a corn plant, that would be considered localized. But we're talking in many cases below 1/10 of an inch in turf on putting green surfaces. So if it even moves a tiny bit, you could just consider it to be agripedal in the turf market. You're really only getting 55 to 50% of that fungicide absorbed by the plant, and when the amount of that fungicide starts to be grown out by new growth, that's when you start to need to reapply. And again, as I mentioned, just remember, it's not like you need to check the KOC value of every single product every time you make an application, but having a fundamental or a general understanding of the importance of that and which products have really high values and which ones have really low values will help you determine the best product you can use for a particular root pathogen. Because if it's going to move down a little bit more, even if it's another 1/2 inch, that can be very important with helping with control. And this is why, again, I'm just going to go back to this slide showing that really no matter what you do, most fungicides, almost all fungicides, are going to stay in that top 1 to 2 inches. Again, this is different with insecticides and herbicides, but with fungicides, just so you know, you're really not going to water them through anything. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is the soil-borne pathogen, Rhizoctonia, which causes large patch on warm season turf grasses. It's caused by the Basidiomycete Rhizoctonia solani, which is the exact same pathogen, if you're thinking in your head, as the one that causes brown patch on cool season turf grass. It's just a slightly different, what we call an anastomosis group in pathology, which really isn't important in terms of control. But it's essentially the same thing. It affects the base of the plant. It can be problematic on a number of different species of warm season turf grass, primarily zoysia grass, centipede, and St. Augustine. Those that are listening are likely in the mid-Atlantic region, and you're going to deal mostly on this with zoysia. So as zoysia has continued to move farther north, particularly for tee boxes, approaches, and fairways, one of the biggest things you're going to battle with zoysia grass is going to be large patch. The pathogen actively grows and infects when host tissues are around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. But typically large patch infection and disease expression is going to determine anytime there's significant free leaf moisture, significant rainfall events, and you have poor drainage, and the turf is not growing to the best of its ability, and that's going to be in the shoulder seasons in the spring and fall. Oftentimes you see this disease occurring when you have green up or with stuff's going into fall dormancy. Excessive nitrogen will contribute to disease severity with large patch. So it's not that you don't want to fertilize, but you just don't want to go crazy with the nitrogen. Symptoms on individual leaves, reddish brown, can be black lesions right above the sheaths in the crown area. But oftentimes it's most easily recognized by those orange yellow color that it has along the edge, and the large, as it gets its name, the larger patches that are, can be anywhere from several inches to several feet in diameter. Research continues to be ongoing for optimal fungicide timing. With this particular pathogen and disease, because it occurs in both, along the base of the plant, but in the foliage, it's a little different than just timing your typical root pathogens. But you want to make it when the thatch temperature, or right there just below the green tissue, is around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The addition of a surfactant along with very light post-application irrigation, so we're talking like 1/10 of an inch or less, can increase control of the pathogen, because it's actually going to knock it off the leaf blades and get it down there right to the base of the plant, the sheath and the crown area where it needs to be in order to provide optimal control. Applications are going to be determined by weather conditions, but really the best programs that I've seen throughout the mid-Atlantic, down in the transition on the Carolinas, up into Eastern Maryland, all that kind of stuff, is 2 fall applications and 2 spring applications, typically 28 days apart. If you can't do 2 and 2, 2 fall apps and then 1 spring app would be considered good. But again, if you have a really, really dry fall and you're not seeing any disease development, and you're not worried, no big rainstorms are predicted before it goes into dormancy, well, maybe you can hold off on the second fall app. Conversely, if you're in the spring and it's doing nothing but raining for months and months and months, then maybe you may need to make a second or even a third application. But the good news is that various modes of action are very good controlling this pathogen, particularly SDHIs and DMIs. So when you're going to go out, again, 70 Fahrenheit, 2 fall and 2 spring if you can, 21 to 28 days apart in between applications of both the spring and the fall. The very effective fungicide groups are going to be your DMIs, your SDHIs, and your strobilurins. The best 2 active ingredients that I could say for large patch are going to be flutalonil, which is pedigree fungicide, and then prothioconazole, which is a newer DMI fungicide by the name Denzicor. Here's an example of applications, or I should say control of large patch with preventive applications with pedigree fungicide, which is flutalonil. Pedigree is the new formulation. Well, I'll get to that, I guess I'll say in a minute. But this is on zoysia down at University of Arkansas. On the left would be the non-treated control plot. You can see significant disease development there. And this was first thing in the spring, so this was only with 2 fall applications. And you can see the plot there on the right-hand side providing 100% control of that. Okay, any questions on large patch control? All right, next we're going to do take all root rot. So take all root rot is going to be a little bit more of a challenging disease to control than large patch. A lot of times you'll start to see disease development occur chlorotic areas like this, smaller circular patches that coalesce into larger areas of decline. On the right-hand side, you can see an area on the left was an area that was healthy, and an area on the right was one of those chlorotic areas. And you can see the significant impact it had on the root zone there with the infected area. So this is also what we call an ERI pathogen, or an ectotrophic root infecting pathogen. It's most problematic on Bermuda grass, St. Augustine grass, used to be called St. Augustine decline, and then also seashore paspalum. I doubt anybody on here is probably growing that, but if they are, it can be an issue. Greens that have poor drainage, over irrigated, that's where, and most stressed out, especially during the shoulder seasons, that's where you're going to see this disease occur. It's not going to show up in the midsummer on warm season grasses. This is also going to be a shoulder disease. So in contrast with warm season grasses, in contrast to what we see with cool season grass, where cool season gets diseases in the middle of the summer, your warm season grasses are going to get diseases or most affected by diseases in the shoulder seasons in spring and fall. The pathogen that causes it is somewhat slower growing, and it infects the stolons and roots in the late summer and into the spring. The disease is active when soil temps are in the upper 70s and the mid 80s, and then down into the 60s, and it kind of goes away when they get above the mid 80s and when it gets down into the 50s. So symptoms are yellowish or whitish irregular patches up to several feet in diameter, and you're going to see dark stolons, dark roots in areas that are compared to healthy turf. There's some really good work that was done also out of NC State on this one by Cam Stevens. That is graduate student at the time, and it turns out we used to think that it was just we used to call it GGG, Gamenomyces graminis, but now it turns out that there's actually 5 different pathogens that cause take all root rot on warm season turf. Is this important for everything generally? No, but just know that as with any other disease, when you have different species and even different genus that cause a disease, you might have slightly different effects from fungicides. So a fungicide that's hands down the best thing on Gamenomyces graminis, it may not be quite as effective if you have one of these other ones. So if you're not seeing the efficacy that you want out of a particular fungicide, sometimes, especially when there's a complex of pathogens that cause a disease, you could look to rotating to a different product to see if you get better efficacy out of that. This is just looking. This is a cool image, I thought, and why I added it, showing how soil temperature affects pathogen growth. These are the 5 different pathogens. You can see primarily growth is occurring between 68 and 86 degrees Fahrenheit at the 2-inch depth, which is when you're going to want to make your or when the soil temperature is that. So that's when you're going to want to make your applications. You want to actually start them earlier in the summer. A lot of times people would say make them later in the fall. Turns out that making applications earlier in a time frame of like August, and then in September or late August and late September into October is when you're going to want to make your applications. Again, a 2 and 2 program, 2 fall and 2 spring, or 1 late winter, so sometime in January into February, and then March or April would be an ideal program. Methyltrifluconazole is a very good active ingredient as part of a program. So are the strobilurins. And again, make sure you get as much water down on it as you can, up to 1/8 of an inch. Next disease we're going to cover is fairy ring. This is probably one of the most challenging pathogens to control. There's 3 different types. Type 1 is obviously the one that's going to cause the most issue, like you see in this photo, where you get an area of dead turf. And this is due to hydrophobicity with the soil. So a wetting agent program is going to help out. Type 2 is the other one that's most problematic because it just gives you the green rings. Type 3 is only going to be a circle of mushrooms and would be considered the least problematic in turf. Control can be really difficult, and that's because you can get the kind of like thick cords of hyphae or of the pathogen mycelia down underneath in the soil. And you need to make sure you get the fungicide there. Preventive applications, the best thing you can do is start a preventive application when soil temperatures at 2-inch depth reach 55 Fahrenheit for 3 to 5 consecutive days. You want to use at least 2 gallons per 1,000 of carrier volume for these apps. And products need to be watered in with at least, I would say, 2/10 to 1/4 inch of water. Uses of wetting agents are helpful. Just make sure if you're applying older DMIs and you're using like really old wetting agent technology, which I wouldn't recommend anyway, but there are some interactions from really, really old products. So talk to your distributor up about using some of the newer stuff that's in the market from wetting agents. The most effective groups, again, are going to be your DMI fungicides, your SDHI fungicides, and your strobilurin fungicides. So things like tebuconazole, flutalanyl or pedigree fungicide, and then it's oxystrobin or fluoxystrobin. You'll notice I don't have pyraclostrobin listed on here. That's because the KOC value on that fungicide is extremely high. So if you look on the bottom there, flutalanyl is going to be from like 600 to 1,600, whereas pyraclostrobin is going to be 6,000 to 16,000, meaning it's somewhat immobile or it is immobile, somewhat in the soil. So when you're trying to water something down farther, looking for a product with that lower KOC is going to be helpful. Pedigree fungicide is an SC formulation of flutalanyl. Most of you know flutalanyl as ProStar. ProStar is no longer available in the marketplace. Pedigree is the new formulation of flutalanyl going forward, and it's a liquid, which is really nice. It's a great program approach, especially if you got fairy ring, and for cool season people that may hear this. It also preventive applications for fairy ring with watering in are also going to control things like whitea patch, brown patch, and yellow patch. Here's an example of control that you'll get. This 2 applications on a preventive program. It's the same plot, just looking at it from different angles so you can see all the fairy ring around it, but the very strong control in that plot. In the center here, you can see, or I should say on the left-hand side, it's an application of 2 applications of pedigree, 28-day interval with 2 apps in the spring preventively, and a competitor product is there with a wetting agent on the right-hand side, and you can see that was providing very little control. So if you're having issues with your fairy ring program, or you're looking to add something new or bring something new in, pedigree is an excellent opportunity for that from a preventive standpoint. Okay, I got 2 more diseases, and I'll speed up maybe a tiny bit here. But if you have Pythium root rot issues, Pythium root rot is a significant disease on warm season turf too, ultra-dwarf Bermuda grass greens. A lot of people have it, though, in the transition zone in upper mid-Atlantic on cool season grasses. The photo on the left, or the picture on the left-hand side, or this, I should say the plot on the left-hand side, which is entirely green. There's no pigments or anything added to that. That was just Segway controlling Pythium root rot versus areas around it that were treated either with the area on the right's a non-treated, but the areas around it were ineffective in controlling that particular disease. So Pythium root rot, it's controlled by a variety of different Pythium species. There's no one species that just causes it everywhere. It's problematic on bentgrass and poa greens, but then again, it's also problematic, as I said, on ultra-dwarf Bermuda grass greens. There's no real specific temperature requirements for the disease to occur. What happens is you get infection of the root system earlier on in the year when temperatures are anywhere from 60 to 75 Fahrenheit in the soils when it's actively going to affect. And then once you get stresses like heavy rain, or you have poor irrigation, middle of the summer, or if you're on warm season grass, as you go into the shoulder seasons and turf is stressed out, that's when you're going to start to see root rot. On the right-hand side here, you can see symptoms of Pythium root rot all around this trial area. This would be a non-treated area here as well. And so it's that irregular bronzing discoloration, what you're going to see. And the roots, a lot of times, if you look at an area that's got Pythium root rot, the root system is severely compromised. And unfortunately, if you're not on a preventive program, curative applications with Segway do help, or with Union fungicide, which is a product we have that's Segway with azoxystrobin. It's a great rotational early summer patch disease program and Pythium program product. But you need to make sure you have healthy roots going into the summer, or if it's in the warm season, into the fall. Again, you need to make sure you get immediate post-application irrigation. There was some interesting work done out of the University of Missouri by Lee Miller, who's now at Purdue, looking at irrigation water. It turns out there's a lot of Pythium species and a lot of irrigation water that they looked at, which may be why you get to see a lot of this on greens, because if you're kind of inoculating greens with Pythium species, that's when you would need to be on a preventive program, especially the species that cause root rot. Controlling root rot really now should be a whole lot easier than it has been in the past. Segue was always the best thing you can use. The challenge was there were no great rotational partners with Segue for a true program. Preventive apps should be started when your 2-inch soil temperatures approach 65 Fahrenheit. So in cool season, in the spring when you're warming up, in warm season, it'll be later in the summer or earlier in the spring as you start to either cool down to those temperatures or get up to those temperatures. Again, you want to make sure it's at least an 1/8 of an inch irrigation. But the best 2 products you can use are either Segue and or Union if you're looking for a premix product, and rotating that with picarbutrazox, which is Serrata. So an example of control that we see with that on the left, this is non-treated control. In the center, this is a Segue Serrata rotational program. So every 14 days, Segue was sprayed, and the next 14 Serrata was sprayed, and the next 14 Segue, the next 14 Serrata. Comparatively, this is Banol on the right-hand side. This summer, actually, these photos, again, non-treated here. Here's Segue, which provides, again, outstanding control of Pythium root rot. But what you really want to do is be on a rotational program with Segue and Serrata. It will help both chemistries to last longer. One thing we have a problem doing in the golf industry is creating resistance by continually spraying the same stuff over and over and over again because it works, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. So rotating these products, really, if you have a root rot issue in the past and you're not on this program, highly recommend getting on that program, initiating applications either late summer if you're in warm season grass, running them through the winter, or if you're on cool season grass, starting in the spring and being on a rotational product, particularly if you have poorly drained greens. All right, the last one I'm going to cover here is spring dead spot. And save time here, a few minutes at the end for questions when I'm done with spring dead spot about any of the diseases. But spring dead spot can obviously be extremely severe. And this is a pathogen or disease that gets worse over time. It doesn't get better over time. So if you start to have spring dead spot, it's probably not going to go away. Weather factors may make it less severe from year to year, but it's going to increase over time. So it's caused by 3 species of Ophiosphaerella. The 2 that are primarily problematic in the U.S. are Ophiosphaerella coriae and Ophiosphaerella herpatrica. This is somewhat academic, but I'm going to show you why it's got a little more real-world practicality for you when deciding which products you want to use. So as with many root pathogens, it's not so much that it's actually directly killing turf, like with fairy ring and Pythium root rot or root dysfunction even. You're not actually killing plants, you're just weakening their root systems, and they're unable to get through those adverse growing periods. With spring dead spot, that happens to be with winter dormancy. So the pattern, as all fungi do, it's going to spread out radially, which is why you see those circular patches, and it affects the roots, rhizomes, and stolons via those runner hyphae, which, as you see in the lower right-hand picture, they're just really dark pigmented little hyphae that run along there. And affected stolons here, you can see are really dark, as is indicative, something like take all root rot as well. You have really dark compromised stolons and root zone versus white healthy roots. The pathogen actively grows and infects soil tissues from 75 Fahrenheit down to about 50 Fahrenheit. So it's very similar in its range with temperature, as you see with take all root rot. And as I said, it gets worse over time. And heavy fertilization on Bermuda grass tends to make the plants more susceptible. You really want to monitor 2-inch soil temperatures with this one as well. Once it drops to 70 Fahrenheit for 5 consecutive days, that's when, if you're on a 2 application strategy, you would want to make your first application. You don't want to make it because it's the first week of September or because it's the 4th week of September and that's what you've always done. You just want to go out there and keep an eye on soil temperatures, especially areas where you know it's a problem. Once those soil temperatures drop to 70 degrees Fahrenheit and stay there for a few days is when you could start making applications. Typically, you want to make a sequential application or 21 to 28 days after, but you just want to make sure that second application is made before 2-inch soil temperatures fall much below 60, particularly 55 degrees Fahrenheit. So for those in Maryland or in Delaware or in southeastern PA or northern Virginia, you might want to monitor the second application a little more closely than your peers do down in the Carolinas. Again, this product really needs to be watered in immediately with 1/8 of an inch of irrigation. We've done a lot of work with watering in, and I should have mentioned this during the segue part, but segue, for example, if you leave it on the foliage after about 6 hours, you start to get diminishing returns with controlling root pathogens with that product. So you really don't want to let stuff sit on the stuff and wait for rain to come the next day. You really should be watering in these products immediately to get the most out of them. There's a limited number of active ingredients that are really effective against spring dead spot. We have a little few more now than we used to, or a few more now than we did about 7 years ago. This is work done out of Virginia Tech. And I mentioned it was important to know which species you may have, or if you're having problems with controlling, this may be the issue. So plant material that's sourced from the Midwest tends to be more Ophiosphaerella herpatrica, or the orange line. Ophiosphaerella coriae is more native to the eastern U.S. And you can see that when you're looking for fungicides to control, the fungicide that provides the best control for both species happens to be Cabuto fungicide, or the active ingredient isofetamide, which is an SDHI. So there's 2 different programs you can do with this. There's a single application program, and then there is a 2 application program. This is some work we did in the eastern shore of Maryland. This is looking a large-scale demo. We split the fairway in half. As you can see, the lower half is Cabuto, 2 applications at 1.6 fluid ounces. Comparing that to a peer SDHI fungicide posterity, and you can see Cabuto in this particular demo was lights out and providing near 100% control. The NTC area there cutting across was a non-treated area of the fairway, just so we could show you that disease was occurring everywhere that we didn't spray Cabuto. This is at NC State with Dr. Kearns. On the left-hand side, there's 2 plots here, but this plot right here, you can see right along where they stopped spraying the product too. This is a single application of Cabuto. So those of you that are challenged with having resources to make a lot of applications, or even making 2 applications, this is 2 apps on the left side. On the right side, this is the edge of the plot right here, and which is nice because you can see disease right next to it in the non-treated area. This is 2 applications of 1.6 fluid ounces. Compare that with the non-treated area here, which is obviously riddled with spring dead spot. Again, this was just another year. The little stuff you see in here is actually dollar spot. It started to come up this spring when spring dead spot symptoms were showing. But again, here you see your spring dead spot in the non-treated area, and on the left is going to be a single application of Cabuto at 3.2 fluid ounces, providing 100% control of spring dead spot. Here's 2 apps with Cabuto. You tend to get a little bit better quality. We're not really sure why it controlled dollar spot better. Maybe it was just later in the fall when it knocked down inoculum with that second app. But you can see really good control with Cabuto, whether the single app or 2 applications are used. We've actually been looking. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. I just, this disease has caused a lot of havoc in the Mid-Atlantic this year, just with inconsistencies in control.
Mm-hmm.
From one, I've seen every product under the sun used, from tebuconazole to Posterity Forte to Cabuto, and it seems like from one property to another, control even on the same property fluctuates, which is obviously a challenge. Do you think that's related to watering in? Do wetting agents help the process with the spring dead spot control? Do you recommend using them? And
well, Eric, I promise you, you and I did not discuss for everybody on here but that was going to be exactly what I was going to say, or the 2 things. If you have areas of control that are not working on a course, but like, let's say your greens are really good or your approaches are really good, but you have breakthrough in roughs, I would question the amount of organic material that's there that might be binding. I would also question how quickly irrigation's happening. If you are not getting and our sales guy will be frustrated I say this, but if you are using some of the products you mentioned there, regardless of choice, and you're having significant issues with control on a golf course, it's likely due to the fact that you either are not getting enough application irrigation immediately following, you're not getting enough post-application irrigation period, or you need to be on a wetting agent program because you have too much organic matter and you need something to help pull it down into those top 2 inches better than it's currently doing. So yes to all of those. If you've tried several products and it's not working, that's an issue. Tebuconazole by itself, I understand it's the most economical. It does do something. It is not going to be anywhere near what you're going to get with something like Cabuto. I know that there's a big cost difference there too to the end user that they're going to want to know about, and that's why tebuconazole has been used so much. But especially if you're using some of the heavier hitters, it probably comes down to when irrigation happened and how much was or was not put down immediately. This is just showing again 1 and 2 applications of Cabuto compared to a lot of the other products out there that are being used for control of spring dead spot. This is a new one, and Pat, I can either share this with you, Eric, or Pat Bowers, I know would have it as well. This is a single page piece we put together, just showing, 1 versus 2 applications of Cabuto for spring dead spot control. I honestly, I know I work for PBI-Gordon, but at the same time, just from what I've seen and done, this is the best control you're going to get on the marketplace. The difference with the 1 versus 2 apps, if you're doing a single app, you want to make that application, you want to wait a little longer and you want to make that application when the 2-inch soil temperature drops between 65 and 60. You actually don't want to go out earlier in the fall. So if you're doing the single, a little bit later is better when it's 65 to 60. If you're doing 2 apps, you want to make the first at 70 and the second before it drops below 60. So that's kind of the big difference between those 2 apps. But really, if you're on a Cabuto program and you have any kind of significant breakthrough, I'm going to say it's almost certainly comes down to the amount of irrigation, because it's not with which of the 2 species it is, because Cabuto has been most effective on both of those 2 pathogens. It's probably more of an irrigation issue or an organic matter issue as well. Last thing, down here on the lower left, if any of you are trying out new zoysia stuff, the zoysia greens tend to get hammered, some of the new things with spring dead spot. So just be aware, if you're trying to grow zoysia for putting greens, they tend to get spring dead spot really bad. So just a little quick hit here on some PBI fungicides for a bunch of the diseases we talked about. Segue, industry-leading Pythium control, whether it's for root rot or for Pythium blight. Depending on which one you're going after, Serrata for the root rot would be a great rotational partner. If it's blight, anything from Banol to Subdue to even phosphites are going to be really good. Union is Segue plus azoxystrobin. So this brings the power of Segue for your control of your Pythium species, but Segue only controls Pythium diseases. And you bring in azoxy, it's just a great, late spring preventive root rot, fairy ring, yellow patch, a Whitea patch, summer patch, take all patch kind of program. It's good for 7 to 10 days prior to holiday events if you're looking for something there. And then for those who have Bermuda grass greens, it's great for both Pythium blight and leaf spot. So the azoxy is going to pick up the leaf spot. Pedigree is really an essential tool in a preventive fairy ring program. It seems to be the most across all the different species that cause fairy ring. Even if it's 1 app as part of a program, get it out there at the 3.2 fluid ounce range with a wetting agent or be on a wetting agent program and make those apps when the 2-inch soil depth drops to 55. Tekin is a very economical option for controlling a bunch of things, but we're talking patch diseases today. It's very good on take all root rot. It's very good on summer patch. Just make sure you water it in immediately for any of those diseases. And then lastly, Cabuto, as we talked about, it's the product for the spring dead spot market, especially if all you can do is a single application. Cabuto can make that happen. Excellent reference, just to point out, if you want to Google chemical control of turfgrass diseases, it's a publication that's put out every few years, and it gives you all kind of information on fungicide efficacy, watering and all that kind of stuff. And if you're looking for more information about fungicide movement or irrigation stuff, check out the NC State website because they have a whole lot on there. With that, that's all I have to offer. Sorry, I think I ran a minute or two over. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Yeah, like I said earlier, you can utilize the chat or use the raise hand function if you do have them. I appreciate that information today, really useful information, especially with the timing of the year that we're at. I looked at ocean temperatures that are around 77, usually a good indicator of what soil temperatures are in the mid-Atlantic. So we're getting to that point where these spring dead spot applications and some of these other diseases are probably ready to pull the trigger on, or at least in the next coming weeks with the cooler weather coming. So,
yep.
Well, once again, as we wait for any questions that may appear, I just want to thank you again for your time and the partnership that we have with PBI-Gordon. You guys are a tremendous supply partner for us at WS Conley, whether it's 10 barge, whether it's landscape supply or Walker supply. You guys have great reps in the field. Appreciate the time that you've spent today with us and the information you've shared. As a heads up for all of those on the call, GCSAA CEUs have been applied for. We have not received the actual approval code yet. So my plan of attack for that will be to email everybody that was registered for this webinar with a link to the video recording. A PDF of this presentation will be provided to me by Brian, which I'll share in that same email that will also include the GCSAA code. So you should have a follow-up email in your inbox within the next, I would say, 2 weeks to give me some time. But, you know, on the same token, we'll have this presentation available on PDF. In addition to that, the video recording of this is going to be published and available on our website. So we have on-demand section on each of our websites that you can actually go to. And if you have somebody that you want to share this with, you can certainly share the email that I forward in a couple weeks, or you know, go to our website, landscapesupplyva.com or walkersupplyinc.com. We, you know, both of those websites I know for sure have the on-demand. So I see one question. It says, is there a way we can download this PowerPoint presentation to study more? Yep, like I said, Kyle, we'll get this to you. If you want it right away, I can certainly get that to you. With that, thank you. Appreciate everyone's time.
Hey, thank you all for your time. And again, thank you too for the partnership, Eric. And let me know if I can do anything else to help.